The horror started on the eve of Samhain in a foggy vale in Northern Ireland at the dawn of the Celtic race. And once started, it trod the earth forevermore, wreaking its savagery suddenly, swiftly, and with incredible ferocity. Then, its lust sated, it shrank back into the mists of time for a year, a decade, a generation perhaps. But it slept only, and did not die, for it could not be killed. And on the eve before Samhain, it would stir, and if the lust were powerful enough, it would rise to fulfill the curse invoked so many Samhains before. Then, the people would bolt their doors. Those are the opening words of Richard Curtis's Halloween novelization, which is what we're discussing today. Happy Halloween! Oh, my outfit? You like? Thank you! Can you guess who I am? Who knows? Who knows? My returning cult members should all know that I am Lori, not from Halloween, but from Trick or Treat. This is genuinely one of my favorite Halloween costumes I have ever worn. Although these teeth are not doing me any favors, I think that they're giving me a lisp. And do I want my deep dive of the Halloween novelization to be immortalized with this lisp? I just don't think so. So even though I love them, I think I will take them out after my intro. I'm in such a good mood. Obviously, I'm filming this in advance, but on Halloween tonight, I'm going to a party in a graveyard. I'm very excited. Oh, what? Halloween is gonna be over tomorrow. What am I gonna do? Oh no. Join my cult. Click subscribe. That way you can celebrate Halloween all year round with us. Like button, notification bell. That way my videos will always stay in your feed. Today, the Antichrist herself is bringing you the only book to movie comparison of John Carpenter's Halloween that I feel like you'll ever need. We'll start with a little history lesson on this book and why this baby is so hard to get your hands on. We'll break down some of the intentions of author Richard Curtis, and of course, then get into a thorough deep dive of every noteworthy comparison from book to film. Unfortunately, now it is time to remove my fangs. Oh my god. I feel like a kid with like a wiggly loose tooth. Oh, Mom, I got it! Right, well at least I can leave the contacts in. Without further ado, let's get into a little history lesson. I wish that I had some deep-cut crazy story for you about this one, but the reality is novelizations were extremely popular in the 70s and 80s, so it just was the natural conclusion due to this trend. It was published by Bantam Books in 1979, and this was actually the original cover. This one is insanely difficult to get your hands on, it is very rare. The copy that I have is from the 4th printing in 1979, and this book goes for around $150 to $300 depending on the cover and the condition that it's in. I'm incredibly blessed to have a subscriber that sent this to me so I didn't have to track it down. And it's so difficult to track down because even though it went through 10 printings in its original run, it went out of print in the late 80s. So over the course of the last 35-ish years, the numbers have been dwindling, it's just been harder to find. Also, this was written by Richard Curtis, but if you take a look here, the author credited is Curtis Richards. I think it's kind of hilarious that that was one of his pseudonyms. But before we get into his insight, we have to talk about a more recent release of this book. Printed in Blood was the first company to bring this book back into print after almost 40 years. There were 3 different editions, but weirdly, one of them no longer shows up on their website, but that would be the illustrated reprint they did for Halloween's anniversary in 2023. There was an option to buy this one with the original cover art from the original printing, but that is the one that no longer shows up on the website. Then you also had this option that you could buy on its own. They also put out a very limited signed edition that came with prints and original artwork. I found a good Reddit thread of someone who bought every version and detailed exactly what you get and every little difference in packaging, etc. And my research on that will be linked down below. I will link that thread. That's just if you want every single detail. I'll be sharing the most interesting things of note in this video. So the differences between this book and the $300 limited signed edition are as follows. One weird thing about the packaging is that it's not even shrink wrapped. This one did come in shrink wrap packaging, which I think should just be the standard, even if it's a signed edition. Apologies for probably mispronouncing this artist's name, but the signatures of Curtis Richards and Orlando Arocena are on the first page of the book. You also get 2 prints and 1 piece of original artwork that is signed by Orlando Arocena. I found myself pretty irritated with the fact that if I want to get the illustrated version with the original cover artwork, I have to buy the $300 limited edition. It's no longer an option to get the illustrated edition with the original artwork. The only $50 option now, which really is like $73 with shipping and everything, is the digital artwork cover. Maybe that was a choice made for like the real collectors because potentially maybe they already have a copy of the original book with the original artwork. Don't know, just think it was kind of a weird choice. I'm not crazy about this cover art. I'm sure that a lot of people are. I also don't know why that other version doesn't show up on their website because they have other books on their website that are sold out, but not really important. It wasn't until we got this reprinting that we got some insight from the author. So let's go through some of his introduction. He opens by talking about the difficulties of adapting a screenplay into a novel, having to take a single line and develop it into 1,500 words. That can be summarized by his opening line, "A movie isn't a novel, and a novel isn't a movie." He says it's even more difficult when the screenplay is a horror movie because horror movies get away with suppressing the viewer's skepticism. With a book, even if it's a page-turner, the reader can set it down and go, wait, they have all the time in the world to try to make sense of it. That's where he felt the extra challenge came in, with him having to kind of explain things in this novel. And explain them he does. It's cuckoo. Then he talks about where he was at in life when he was approached for this novel. He was a freelance writer at the time, but he didn't know what Halloween would become, so hence why he chose one of his random pseudonyms. He had gone to see the movie and had taken notes and recalls being terrified, but he did note some inconsistencies. Despite the unrelenting action on screen, I managed to keep notes on a pad in my lap, and reading them later, I recognized one paramount fact. A lot of what happened in the movie made no sense. The movie was rife with inexplicable and sometimes contradictory actions that eluded rational explanation. But the scenes had flown by so fast and furiously, neither I nor the audience had any chance to process them. For instance, after being confined in a sanitarium from the age of 6 for killing his sister, Michael, now 21, steals Dr. Loomis's car and drives back to his hometown, committing several unspeakable acts of violence along the way. Okay, but how did Michael learn to drive? I get it, he's talking about his perspective back in 1978, but if you've been in the Halloween fandom for pretty much any length of time, you've probably heard this discussion come up. So surprise, surprise, any answers you would seek about that can be found in this book, which we'll get to in a minute, I swear. Something else he explains is that he had to create a lot more lore surrounding how Michael is supernatural because of the ending of the film. In his words, he says the movie's ending makes you go, whoa, he was supernatural the whole time? And he just felt like that would not translate well in the book. And that's about it. I wanted so much more insight than we got from his introduction. Frankly, I think it's kind of a weak introduction to this book that has so much historical relevance to the franchise, whether the audience knows it or not. It came up in my research of Halloween 6 because Daniel Farrens was heavily inspired by it. I am going to be crafting my thesis throughout that David Gordon Green was heavily inspired as well. There are bits of Halloween 2 that we see in this book. My old deep dive of the Thorn trilogy is not required reading for this video. I would consider it supplementary viewing, so maybe you can check that out after this if you want to get more details about the changes from script to screen, and then obviously from screen to screen, the theatrical cut versus the producer's cut. But before we get into the comparison, just one more thing. I briefly just kind of want to review this book. With what we got here, when I ordered it, I thought that the real value of the book would be in the illustrations. Because can you imagine actually reading something this big? This is ludicrous. I can't imagine like laying down in bed with this book. I can imagine it on the coffee table, I guess. I actually have a Halloween coffee table book on my coffee table right now. Anyway, this is just kind of ridiculous, and also a lot of the artwork is not for me. In what world is digital collage artwork something that you would find in a Halloween novelization? This is one of the most confounding pages of all to me. Like, what the hell is this? This has nothing to do with what's on the page. In the opening, they kind of talk about like goblins and witches that kill chickens and stuff. We'll get into that. But that's not what this is. Like, yes, the classic beloved character, the nail face horned werewolf. We all know that character from the Halloween franchise. Some of it is cool. Like, I like this artwork, but it just has nothing to do with anything. And that is a really strong theme in like the opening pages of the book, the opening chapter. The further out you get, the more relevant the artwork is. Something else that's baffling, there's a sexy photo of a headless woman undressing for what? Chapter 11 here is following Michael as he follows the girls in the car, so not sure the connection with the artwork there. Annie's dead body is draped very sexily over Michael's arms in this photo, and her nipples are peeking out. I don't like this. Like, one of the only values that I saw in a giant illustrated book this big was like, oh, you know, maybe I would let my teenage kids read it or something. But that's a little bit too much. And also the contents of the book are a little disturbing too. Don't get me wrong, I do think like some of the artwork is really cool. It reflects the scene. And I would say that there is more good artwork in this than bad, okay? But that just makes the weird stuff all the more baffling to me. Like, this is beautiful. Was there just too much time spent on that and then the deadline came up quickly? This looks like she's stabbing him in the This must have been a really huge undertaking to be doing all this digital artwork, but when you have other iconic illustrated horror books to live up to, like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, it's like, why doesn't it have a more consistent aesthetic like those books? I don't like this newfangled stuff. I just don't think that digital artwork is really for me. I mean, if it was all like this though, you know, that's really pretty, that's nice, and I'd be like, oh, I would love for my kids to be able to enjoy this. This one of Loomis too, with the kids running out of the house. Oh, it's a shame. I just wish that rather than being in the sleazy tone of the novel, that it was more in line with the actual movie itself. But I think that I'm more or less alone in this opinion. I watched at least 7 different unboxings of this book, and everyone opening it was like, wow, amazing, beautiful artwork. I'm kind of on an island out here, so I guess don't mind me. The last weird thing about this book sort of was that it was shipped wrapped in newspaper around the bubble wrap, and I really enjoy a reduce, reuse, recycle approach, but I wasn't expecting to see a story about some guy who knew Woody Allen that died at 85. Like, I don't know. Okay, that is your history lesson on the Halloween novelization. Hopefully you got some good info on how you can pick it up, whether you go to Printed in Blood or you scour eBay for this little bad boy. That's it. It's time to finally get into the actual comparison. I already read you the intro paragraph, which is just such a beautiful opening to the prologue. It goes on to further explain the traditions of Samhain. It's the Druid festival of the dead that is held in fear of the sun never warming the land again after fall. Druid priests would make all the decisions about who would marry, who would bear children, who would enjoy good health, etc. They also determined who would be sacrificed to keep witches and goblins at bay. That's just the backdrop info. There is an entire little story told in the prologue, and it's about a princess to the Druid king whose name was Deidre. It's also told about a 15-year-old boy named Edna who was in love with her. When there are rumors about the king marrying her out, Edna goes to his uncle, his dad, and his brother, and he asks if he should offer his hand to her. And they all just roast the shit out of him. Ho, Deidre marry you? His father cackled. With your shriveled arm and your twitching mouth? For Edna had presented himself wrong end first when his mother birthed him, and the midwives had made a botch of his delivery. His brother and uncle, like, compare him to their dog. They say, oh, she'd rather marry my goat than you. Despite this, our boy Edna comes up with a plan to ask her to marry him anyways. But when he tries to, it all goes to hell. She gets so scared of him when he approaches her that she tumbles into a stream, and while she's floundering about, she refuses to be saved by him. She calls him a monster. She screams he's trying to me. Edna's body had been deformed at birth, but not until that moment had his soul been deformed. Uh-oh. He was utterly humiliated, and to add insult to injury, he had to watch her dancing happily with her new fiancé during the Samhain festival celebrations, and everyone was stoked for them. Drunk and pissed beyond reason, he used a foot-long butcher blade to cut her fiancé's throat and stab her through the chest. The thrill of revenge was the last emotion Edna knew. For a moment later, he was literally torn apart by the enraged tribe. Only his head and his heart were preserved, gathered up after the frenzy had subsided, at the request of the grieving king. After Deidre and Cullion were buried on the hallowed ground the following day, Edna's head and heart were carried to the summit of the Hill of Fiends, where cowards and other outcasts were left to rot unblessed. The king asked his shaman to pronounce a special curse over the remains of this vile murderer. Thy soul shall roam the earth till the end of time, reliving thy foul deed and thy foul punishment, and may the god Muk Allah visit every affliction upon thy spirit forevermore. Immediately after that incantation, it started snowing. The priest was satisfied with his work. Halloween ends, spoiler, by the way, but this really reminds me of the scene where they throw Michael's body into that giant grinder, no? The rest of the prologue very briefly details how Samhain has changed, how it's evolved over the years. The Romans took the tradition back from the English Isles in the form of the harvest festival of Pomona. The early Christians turned it into Hallowmas. The popes in the Middle Ages turned November 1st into All Saints' Day. Slowly, the holiday morphs into what it is now. It basically was a holiday born out of the sheer terror of not knowing if your civilization would survive through winter, of whether or not a goblin or a witch would steal your toddler away. And now it's somewhat trivialized with the remnants of the old traditions, like lighting jack-o'-lanterns or pulling little pranks. Except that from time to time, the innocent frolic of All Hallow Even was shattered by some brutal and inexplicable crime, and the original spirit of the celebration was brought home to a horrified world. Then the people would bolt their doors. Scant good it did hid them. And besides, there were always the unwary. That's the prologue. It's a lot to take in. Don't worry, I will not be detailing the entire book so intensely, but I'm gonna have to remain pretty in detail because in chapter 1, Michael talks. You think you're ready for Michael's childhood lore? No, you're not. We still can't even get into the movie comparison because there is an additional scene in chapter 1. It sets the stage in 1963 during the Cold War and how those tensions were just starting to creep into Haddonfield. America was on the precipice of violence with the upcoming Vietnam War. JFK would be assassinated soon, but never mind all that because tonight was Halloween and little 6-year-old Michael Myers was stoked on his clown costume. He's visiting his grandmother, he's trying to show it off, but she disapproves. We never had that 5 and dime junk when we grew up on the farm. We took Halloween seriously. Why, when we set up scarecrows and jack-o'-lanterns, it was because we were genuinely trying to scare off the boogeyman. Now he played real pranks and did some real damage. He didn't just go around like they do today, slapping people's clothes with socks filled with chalk dust and soaping their windows. What did the boogeyman do, Grandma? Mrs. Myers shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I don't think Michael wants to hear that, she said, looking significantly at her mother. It might give him bad dreams. Michael insists on hearing the story of the boogeyman. He wants to hear all about how he went around beheading people's chickens. Michael's mom is getting mad at her for sharing so much with this young boy, but Grandma just can't help herself, okay? She just continues to walk down memory lane. She tells Michael of the time that someone's barn was burned down. She tells him of the story when her home was almost burned down because somebody had cut their hog's throat and stuffed it into the chimney somehow, despite the hog being 300 pounds and them not having a ladder. His grandma vehemently stands on the fact that it was the boogeyman. Michael's mom, she is getting mad because she says, you know what, Michael has been having enough problems lately. I told you he's been getting into fights at school, at home too with Judith. He's been wetting his bed again, which he hasn't done in 3 years. Fighting about what? Mother, can we just forget? The old woman's eyes narrowed. No, we can't. What kind of trouble is the boy in? Voices, Mrs. Myers finally blurted after a minute's tortured pause. He hears voices. She says that the voices tell Michael to say that he hates people. It's gotten to the point where she's considering psychiatric help for him. And though she's in denial about this, Grandma reminds her that this is exactly how it started with Grandpa Nordstrom. So Mrs. Myers' grandpa, her father's father, suffered the same affliction as Michael. Getting some conflicting feedback right now from this book. The grandma fervently believes in the boogeyman. She was a child when she felt she had these experiences. But there seems to be some hereditary psychosis at play as well, but from the other side of the family. Mrs. Myers then alludes to some sort of violent incident that took place with her grandfather, but Grandma shuts it down because Michael is coming back into the room, so we have to wait to hear what that was. So they send Michael off to go trick-or-treating, and at that point, Grandma wonders, should I have mentioned Grandpa Nordstrom's dreams? I wonder if this book is trying to allude to the fact that the curse of Edna has somehow been passed down through, the line of men in this family. But Edna didn't get lucky before he died, so maybe they're related to, like, his uncle or his brother or something. Or it's not related at all. I don't know. The prologue suggests that Edna's spirit is roaming the earth. He's doomed to repeat what happened to him in life. But then this would suggest that it's more of a hereditary thing. It's just interesting. In any case, there is one more additional scene in the book before we get started with the events of the movie. This is when Judith Myers is getting ready for her date and Michael comes to the door with other trick-or-treaters. Huh? What are you gonna do if I don't give you anything? They shrugged, shuffled their feet, giggled nervously. Then one of them said, we're gonna kill you. Judy sucked in her breath. Who said that? The children looked at each other, then looked back at her. Michael Myers, was that you? Because if it was, it's not funny, and I'm telling mother and father when they come home. I'm not Michael Myers. I'm a clown. Guys, I don't know, but I don't think the haters can continue to hold Rob Zombie at gunpoint for his humanization of child Michael Myers anymore. Would I have preferred that he did a little scene with Grandma instead of all the white trash yelling? Yes. But this book kind of pathologizes Michael. It's not like a switch that's flipped. It seems like he actively hates his sister. There's this gradual buildup of the nightmares. He's wetting his bed. He's hearing voices. He tells his sister that he might kill her. Oh, I also should specify that the page numbers are based on this copy of the book. I have a link to the PDF of the book listed down below, but the page numbers unfortunately don't line up there, and they certainly do not line up with this giant book. So I don't know how useful the page numbers will be for you, but I just figured I'd include them. On page 17, they drop some lore about the Myers family that I actually have speculated on in the past, particularly when making my predictions for Halloween Ends, because I've always been curious about the return of Michael's parents in some form, of any of his other family members, but it's never come back up in the franchise. In the book, there's a mention that the Myers go to the movie theater every Halloween because they hate the sound of the doorbell ringing. And this is finally where the book starts to line up with the movie. Of course, the book adds a little bit more interesting dialogue. There is more of a build-up before the couple goes up to the bedroom. The book also details Michael's POV a lot more as he witnesses this. It was the voice. The voice stirred up the hatred. It had done so in his dreams, and now it was doing so in real life. It had begun with the strange pictures in his head at night, pictures of people he had never seen. Oh, maybe in comic books or on television, but never in real life. People in strange costumes, animal skins, armor, leather, drinking and dancing wildly around a fire. One couple in particular, they looked like Judy and Danny, madly in love with each other, dancing in a circle around the huge bonfire, while he, Michael, stood in the crowd hating them, burning up with jealousy. So the voice in Michael's head is presumably Edna. Like I said, he is reliving his foul deed and his punishment. An interesting transference with Judith, because maybe it would have made a little bit more sense if Michael had killed like a crush of his that didn't work out, mind you. But now that a very distinctive motive has been laid out, and you've seen it clearly illustrated in the book, what do you think? Michael has long been held as a killer with no distinct motive outside of the original sibling timeline. But to close out this opening scene, in the book, Michael canonically stabs her 50 times all over her body, which makes him feel exalted. Then the rest of the chapter briefly covers the same events of the movie, with his parents discovering him outside. Chapter 4 is the last for a while that details scenes that we don't see in the movie. The rest of this deep dive comparison will focus more on lore drops and little tweaks and enhancements to the story. But in chapter 4, Richards has decided to fill us in on the years at the sanatorium. So once again, let's maybe turn our pitchforks away from Rob Zombie. I only say that just because he was not the first to do it. It's been happening since 1979, this narrative and this filling in of the gaps of his childhood. I'm not saying to point your pitchforks at Richard Curtis either. He created a lot of interesting stories in this chapter, starting with the sentencing of Michael. And it's here that I first learned that his middle name is Audrey, by the way. By all appearances in court, he was this sweet little angelic normal boy who just so happened to be confessing to murder. They thought that it was Danny for the longest time, and he got very close to being tried, but the only conclusion drawn by this case was that Michael suffered from passing madness. Looking ashen and exhausted, he reconvened the hearing a week later. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, in 42 years as a loyal servant of the law and of this court, I have never been asked to make as remotely cruel a decision as the one I am now compelled to make. The judge in this story was so distraught about his decision to send Michael away that he ordered that the case be revisited every 6 months, and that he should be brought before the court at age 21 to be tried again as an adult. Michael starts crying as he's being escorted from the courtroom, and even all the surrounding reporters seem to be sympathizing with him, all except one. Like everyone else, Loomis had been deeply touched by the angelic appearance and manner of the little boy until, as the boy was reciting the events of the evening of October 31st, 1963, his eyes had happened to lock with Loomis's. The man felt a chilly foreboding that almost curdled his blood. 6 months later, Loomis has to meet with Judge Christopher once again. The judge is very much a character in this chapter, and Loomis has to report to him about the goings-on at Smith's Grove. We learn many things. He is the youngest patient in the ward by 8 or 9 years. The other delinquents are scared to death of him. He can turn them to stone with a single stare. There's a beloved trustee there named Gilden who pulled a very harmless prank on Michael, as he does with a lot of the children. He just loosened the cap of the salt shaker so that Michael accidentally dumped a ton of salt onto his food, and later that night, Michael inexplicably poisoned him. He had no access to the kitchen, there was no proof, people couldn't figure out how he did it, and yet Gilden came down with stomach cramps so severe that they labeled it as food poisoning. And Loomis describes the other boys there as a restless herd of cattle that can sense a wolf nearby. "Judge," said Loomis, collapsing into a leather chair, "the boy's story and attitude haven't changed a whit since the hearing, though I have spent nearly 2 hours a day with him every day for 6 months. I have nothing to go on but my experience and my hunches, and I tell you, out of the depths of all I have learned and observed in 15 years of exploration of the human mind, Michael Myers may be the most dangerous person I have ever handled." But all of this doesn't sway the judge. He says by their next meeting he needs to have some hard proof, otherwise he's considering Michael's release. A version of this scene actually does exist, but it's in the made-for-TV version of Halloween 1978, which was shot in 1981. It's Loomis's first 6-month check-in, but it's happening at Smith's Grove. Loomis wants him removed from Smith's Grove immediately to a higher security facility. He's trying to argue his case, but they're arguing back, saying Michael's catatonic, that he has no reaction to external stimuli.
He's covering up. This catatonia is a conscious act.
He's essentially doing the same thing from book to screen here, trying to argue that there is much more to Michael than meets the eye.
You fooled them, haven't you, Mike? But not me.
More troubling events occurred, but Loomis still could not acquire any evidence. For instance, one night a boy was scalded by his shower and Loomis suspected it was revenge, but Michael had apparently never even left his bedroom. A nurse fell down the stairs and fractured her hip. Another boy was hospitalized for a month with a vicious rash, but no one had direct evidence or saw him ever doing these things. Nonetheless, everyone grew very fearful of Michael, and that meant that he pretty much always got his way. Nothing ever happened to Loomis though, because Loomis presumes he was the only thing that would help him get out of the institution. You could stroll out of here. Such is the power you exert over them. Isn't that true, Michael? The boy's eyes clouded and he shrugged his shoulders. I don't know what you mean, sir. But you won't do it, Loomis said almost smugly. You won't do it because you have it made here. Here you have your own little world. If you were to escape, why, what would await you out there but strife and hassle? So you stay here, snug and secure. Isn't that true, you little div? He stops himself there, realizing that he is not being professional. A lot of lore given to us about his days at Smith's Grove. And this reminds me of Malcolm McDowell's interpretation of Loomis as well, how he crosses inappropriate boundaries and how he calls Michael in a weird way his best friend.
In a weird way, you've become like my best friend.
Obviously, there's a lot less subtlety in Rob Zombie's interpretation of this, and he also created the arc that Michael slowly went more mad during his time at the institution. In the novel, he is much more calculated, and the evil within him seems like a constant. All of this is making Loomis very nervous about his next follow-up with the judge. More months go by, and he has no evidence to back up his hunch. Until, in mid-October, Michael asks Loomis, "Can we have a Halloween party?" At first, Loomis is like, "No way, Jose," but then he agrees to it because he goes, wait, maybe I can finally get some evidence here. And during the week leading up to Halloween, Michael is acting very restless, and Loomis is chalking this up to anniversary syndrome. By all accounts, he's just following that classic pattern, and so Loomis stays the course. On Halloween, the gym was all decked out in decor, and all the boys and the girls got to have the party together. Michael was once again dressed as a clown, and during the party, they started to play some games. During a game of musical chairs, a girl named Sophie stole the last chair from Michael. Loomis took note of this. During the next game, which was bobbing for apples, the lights went out. Loomis had been prepared for anything but this. He leapt from his chair and ran in the pitch darkness for the spot where he thought the vat was. He bowled over several shrieking children and groped the last few steps until he collided with the platform on which the vat stood. At that moment, the hospital's own emergency generators, which tripped on automatically when the main utility system failed, brought light back into the auditorium. Sophie lay face down beside the vat, drenched from the waist up. Loomis searched the room for Michael. He stood under a basketball backboard, at least 10 steps away, smiling. Loomis looked at the boy's costume and hands. They were completely dry. Loomis's plan had failed, but he still ended up getting lucky. The night before Loomis was scheduled to go plead his case, Judge Christopher had been rushed to the hospital but passed away from a cardiac event. His successor was far less sympathetic to Michael's case and needed no extra convincing from Loomis to keep him locked up. And so it was that 15 years passed. Now at this point, hopefully you know the Halloween movie very well. I'm assuming your interest in this video maybe comes from a deep love of that film, but this is just something that you haven't really dove into before. Dived? I just want to let you know that I'm not doing a full breakdown of the movie because I have enough to cover as is, so if I skip ahead a little bit at any point, it is intentional. I'm assuming that you can fill in the gaps of the story and understand that I'm just covering the differences. For instance, when Loomis and Marion are driving over to Smith's Grove, the dialogue is nearly verbatim to the film. However, there is an added exchange between them and one of the escaped inmates. Marion actually has to stop the car to avoid running over an escaped inmate, who Loomis hops out of the car to help and ask questions. He asked me if I could help him find his purple lawnmower. I don't think this is any time to be funny, Marion declared indignantly. After all, He said something else, Loomis said ominously. He said, "It's all right now. He's gone. The evil is gone." I do wonder what Marion was going to say when she cut herself off there. I can't even really begin to speculate, to be honest. I did brainstorm it for a little while. I think the author just needed to give her a reason to sort of trail off before Loomis's ominous line. Upon further inspection, Loomis jumps back out of the car. He goes to the security guard booth and he finds the guard dead. His head was twisted on his neck as if some giant had tried to unscrew it. From then on, it plays out as it does in the movie. Michael jumps on the car, he escapes with it. So now we finally move on to Laurie's POV. It kicks off with a big description of her, and canonically, according to the book, she is a huge virgin who does not smoke grass. I get maybe this can be extrapolated from the scene where Laurie is coughing, but then why would she be smoking in that scene in the first place, you know? Clearly she dabbles. Now remember in the movie when we first meet Laurie, Laurie she is going to drop off the keys at the Myers house. In the book, we get some insight into her mind, and she is thinking about the tragedy that happened 15 years prior. And we get some good lore from her thoughts. The Myers had moved away from their home just a couple of months after the incident because the gawking and the shame from the neighbors became intolerable. They moved to somewhere in Indiana, and they continued to pay their mortgage loan and taxes, which was a huge financial burden. In all those 15 years, it was unsellable, and Chester Strode referred to it as the white turkey. I couldn't find an idiom that matched this online. The closest thing that I could find was talk turkey, and that means to get down to business, like let's talk turkey. So make of that what you will, or maybe some Midwesterner out there actually can fill us in. Anyway, he even tried to sell the house to people by saying just raise it, level it to the ground, buy it just for the price of the land, and people would not do it. Thank God for the New York couple who thought the house was just what they were looking for, and who were too sophisticated to believe in the nonsense the neighbors prattled about. In fact, the New York couple actually thought the idea of a haunted house was charming, something they could boast about. So Mr. Strode gave the New Yorkers something else they could boast about, a price so ridiculous it was, to use his patented phrase, lower than a song. This little paragraph feels like the inspiration for Big and Little John, some of my favorite characters of the whole franchise. Not that they're super sophisticated in personality, but they have really high-end decor and food preferences. They enjoy telling the story of Michael Myers to the children who mess with them. I think that they're rather charmed by the history of their house. There's another Halloween Kills nod in here that we don't see in the movie. Laurie starts to walk away from the house, and Michael appears, as he does in the movie. But in the book, we get a glimpse into Michael's mind and kind of an extension of the scene. He breathed heavily, raspingly, as he watched the girl, and a memory entered his mind. The memory of another girl, another blonde, willowy and pretty. He remembered the trapped and frightened look in her eyes, and the futile, pathetic way she had raised her hands to protect herself. Interestingly here, obviously Laurie is not canonically the sister of Michael Myers, but there is a comparison drawn by Curtis and therefore by Michael himself. I think we all know the story of John Carpenter crushing a six-pack just to be able to write the script for Halloween 2, and that was when he hatched the sibling idea. There's unfortunately no public interview where he's ever cited that he has read the novelization. I kind of doubt it, but I do wonder because that feels like a line that could be the seed of inspiration for that. The extension of this scene comes when Michael heads up to the bedroom where he killed Judith, and he watches Laurie and Tommy walk away. Instead of coming out to the sidewalk to watch her, he does so from the room. Laurie turns back, she thinks that she sees the shape, but she rubs her eyes and then he's gone. I feel that this had to be the source material for Halloween Kills. I feel like Halloween Kills was the first movie of the franchise to explicitly state that he always returns to his home and specifically to that room. For as much shit as David Gordon Green gets, as soon as you even just start skimming the surface of all the connections that he made to like the entirety of the franchise, you start to realize just like how intentionally crafted that trilogy was. I once did a comparison of Halloween H2O to Halloween Ends, but maybe it would be more appropriate to compare Halloween Ends to Halloween 3 and 4. It lifts a lot of inspiration and homage from 3, but then it feels like kind of an indirect spiritual sequel to Halloween 4. But that's not what we're talking about today. Anyway, just worth mentioning because it seems to me anyway that he and the other writers apparently connected a lot to this original novel. After Michael stares at Laurie for a minute, in the made-for-TV version, we cut back to Smith's Grove actually. Loomis has gone to investigate and Michael has trashed his room. It turns out he let out all the other patients, but the most damning sign that Loomis sees is that he has written sister on his door. Now this was shot in 1981 and I believe that it was done so after Halloween 2 had been written. So once again, I would love to know what you think. What do you think was the original source inspiration for John Carpenter to make them siblings in the original sequel? We're now on to chapter 7 and things are largely the same here, but we get these little blips of huge lore drops. Like we covered earlier, Curtis was concerned about realism. How did he drive the car? And he answers it here. He was doing all right last night. Maybe somebody around here gave him lessons. If you read the file, you know that he had run of the place. Inmates and staff alike were scared to death of him and indulged his every wish. Someone could very well have taught him how to drive. I believe that that's an extension of actual dialogue in the movie too. And that has been the long-standing explanation by the fandom. I didn't realize that that originated in the novel. Curtis really did some heavy lifting for the conspiracy theorists of the fandom. And then something crazy that he drops on page 56 is that Loomis has a wife. In the film franchise, canonically, he is not married. But when he goes to use the phone booth on the side of the road, the first person that he calls is his wife. In order of least importance, by the way, he basically just tells her that he won't be able to rest until Michael is caught and that she shouldn't open the door tonight. Then of course, we catch back up with Tommy and Laurie. There's a weird discrepancy where Tommy describes Michael as having dark red stained lips and purple rimmed eyes. And small thing here, in the book, Tommy is the one that runs into Michael, not one of the bullies. And I like that kind of minor switch. Then we're walking with Lori and Linda, and I just don't like the way that he writes the girls in this book. He describes Lori's beauty as understated, and the way that Linda dressed shouted here to anyone with eyes to see. That everything Linda does with her appearance is alien to Lori's way of thinking. That kind of behavior just would not be alien to another teenage girl. It might be alien to an adult man's brain, but that's not the perspective he's supposed to be writing from. Anyway, I do enjoy that he was thoughtful enough to give us an explanation for her incessant use of the word totally. Linda was a lightning rod for trendy phrases, which she used to exhaustion for a month, then dropped from her vocabulary forever, to everyone's immense relief. 3 months ago, it had been weird. 2 months ago, gross. Last month, she was calling everyone Jack. This month's word was totally. You get a little bit about Annie, too, that Linda characterizes her voice as so sharp it could shatter a hero sandwich. Never heard that phrase before. And that when she catches up to them, they all double their pace because Annie always has somewhere to be, and that nobody knows why she's in such a rush. I also really don't like the way that he writes about her, the way that he writes about all the teenage boobs and butts in this movie, about how they jiggle under her shirt because she was the first to abandon her bra and her virginity. I think it just annoys me because it's so obviously told from a male perspective. If a woman were writing about the same things, I feel like it would go a little something like, Lori tried the braless trend after Linda told her it was all the rage, but all it gave her was sore boobs. She wondered if the other girls thought the pain was worth the fashion statement or if she was just sensitive. Not like Linda walked up the path to her house, her tightly clad rear jiggling seductively. It just gives me the creeps. But now you can start to understand why this contains a lot of the nudity. It's kind of just going along with the style of the book. On a lighter note, everyone's entitled to one good scare, right? Lori then runs into Sheriff Brackett and gets startled. In the book, she tried to do a judo move that she learned from her gym teacher. So he's behind her, she grabs his wrist and tries to roll forward, but he effortlessly holds his ground, and then she turns around and realizes who it is. That would have been so funny if that was in the movie. I cannot imagine Lori whipping out a judo move. In addition to that scene being extended, there's an added scene with Lori and her mom right after that. Lori asks her if she's ever met anyone evil, and this takes her mom aback. Her mom is like, well, Hitler, I guess, but I was kind of too young to remember that. And Lori then probes further, asking her about Michael Myers. Her mom lets her know that his case was mentioned at the last Sunday service that she attended, so I guess the Strodes are religious, perhaps Christian. While Reverend Peters said the Myers case, which happened on Halloween 15 years ago, reminds us that true evil still exists in this world. He said that like everything else, we've tried to deodorize evil and put it in a bright new package, and you can buy it at the supermarket for 5 cents off with a coupon. Then along comes something like the Myers case, and we're left with our mouths open looking into the, what did he call it? The heart of darkness. Maybe that's why God put devils like the Myers kid on Earth, to keep us aware of the darker side of human nature. This prefaces the moment where Lori looks outside the window and sees Michael, and I just really like that in the dialogue there kind of are the consistent callbacks to the roots of paganism with the holiday. I think it sets a much more eerie tone. The movie solely kind of relies on Loomis as the town crier trying to convince everyone of his evil. This takes it up a notch for me because I feel like it makes it more applicable to humanity as a whole. That Michael is not uniquely evil, but people like him and events like that exist in general. Now, the movie obviously captures the banality of evil that has touched people in many ways. I have my qualms with calling him evil, but I think that that is a huge topic of discussion for another day. Lori's mom is like, are you sure you're not coming down with something? But she reassures her that it's just a case of the Halloween spooks. Once again though, when she sees Michael, the description feels off to me. Why does Curtis describe his lips as rouge red? Could you imagine if Michael actually had red lips like a clown? Anyway, we skip ahead to Annie picking up Lori, and Curtis adds a beat where Lori screams at some trick-or-treaters. She's a little jumpy in the movie for sure, but I think reasonably so, you know, running into someone and then seeing a whole ass man in her backyard. She goes on to justify seeing Michael to Annie as saying, well, maybe it just was like my old neighbor. And there's more dialogue between her and Annie that just makes me nostalgic for a time past, a time that I will never get to experience in the way that they did. Annie's talking about how they're just gonna cruise around town and just see who's hanging out and with whom and see what they're gonna do before they babysit. And I'm like, how nice. No constant access, no texting. The most shocking addition to this scene is as follows. Annie looked in her rearview mirror before hanging a left and casually noted the same station wagon she'd shouted at after school. It was about 50 yards behind her. It was probably nothing, and not wanting to alarm Lori more than the poor girl was already alarmed, Annie decided to say nothing. Annie sees Michael following them. I I understand this addition. It's a fun Easter egg in the movie when Loomis is looking everywhere but directly behind him when Michael drives by. This kind of feels like a natural extension of that, and also kind of serves as a reminder to just trust your gut. They also go on to chat about some of the more existential topics surrounding Halloween, which I really enjoy. Laurie brings up something called the Alexandria Quartet, and how in one of the novels, the author describes that people do terrible things on Halloween because they're wearing masks. I think this kind of dialogue would have elevated the movie in the sense that it certainly would have made it more cinematic. It would have felt more dramatic and woven the themes together, I think maybe a little bit better. But then we wouldn't have gotten the sense of everyday realism that made Halloween so terrifying for the time. But we do get a nugget of realism from the book that we don't get in the movie, and it's that Brackett can smell the weed on Annie and Laurie, and he calls it whoopee weed, which I've never heard that one before. We also get an interesting line of dialogue when he's speaking to Loomis. They bring up even more topics about Halloween, and Brackett just says, you know, I'm stretched too thin, there's a ton of property damage and stuff that we gotta keep our eye on during this night, but we're talking about something else, Sheriff. Another dimension. I've never heard Michael's origins explained that way, not even from Loomis himself. Like, what is this, Stranger Things? And we'll touch on that again later. But the biggest lore drop of this scene is finally circling back to what happened with Michael's grandpa. We can start to understand more why there was so much concern about his dreams. During the night of Michael's original attack, Mrs. Myers was overheard saying, "He's come back," or "It's come back." She was mumbling on about the thing that had gotten inside of her grandfather, or rather had possessed him, but he'd lost his mind, and Loomis further inquires with Brackett. He says, "What did he do?" "It was at a Grange dance," I think Ron said. "The man just upped and pulled a revolver from his belt and blasted a dancing couple. They hanged him. It had happened on Halloween night." Brackett also shares that that night, his great-grandfather had claimed to hear voices, and when he was asked to identify the names of his victims, he cited the names that he'd heard in his dreams. This perked up Loomis, and he said, "Were the names Deirdre and Cullion? Those were the names in Michael's dreams. Maybe we can establish a continuity here." "A continuity?" Brackett gasped. "Come on, Loomis. In order for a dream to jump 2 or 3 generations, you'd have to believe..." He shook his head. "Doctor, I think you maybe touched yourself." "Probably. It's an occupational hazard." I just thought that part was funny. It's very interesting how indicative this is, I think, of society's fears around mental illness. I think society has even changed drastically since I was a kid in the ways that we've embraced mental health awareness and therapy. Back in my day, you know, like if somebody had their hair dyed pink, it would be like, psych ward. Then the whole scene phase happened and social media happened, and now I feel like people don't really bat an eye. But back in the 60s, they were still giving people lobotomies. I know that obviously we still have our problems. The kind of little girlification of a lot of mental disorders and stuff is a whole problem, but not what this video is about. This story just feels so reflective of the desperation to believe in a literal ancient curse over the fact that, hey, maybe we have some hereditary mental illness. Of course, in this story, the curse happens to be real, but I think you get what I'm exploring here. But let's get back to Michael's point of view, which I don't really like. Michael is his own character with lots of his own thoughts and feelings, which just is not really the Mikey that I got to know in the movies. While he's following Annie and Laurie in the car, his palms are sweaty, his mouth is dry, and he is uncomfortably aroused. He's also having all these vivid memories of his grandmother, of the night that he showed her his costume, of the way she smelled, the candy that he ate. He remembered too how in the middle of it, in the middle of ducking for apples, the feeling had come over him, a force like an iron hand that virtually shoved him out of the door and into the street, his little legs carrying him home and a voice telling him what he had to do. I'm not going to read the middle of this paragraph because he very graphically describes Judith's body parts and I want to spare you. So skipping to the end, he remembered his own internal voice protesting, but it was such a helpless little boy voice, the grown-up voice had shouted it down easily and urged his little legs home faster, instructing him to go into the house through the kitchen door, remove the butcher knife from the drawer under the sink, and go upstairs. This gives Michael so much like plausible deniability almost. The fact that it's not really him or his choice, but rather this compulsion. It's like OCD, final boss, intrusive thoughts, kinda. And it's really horrifying. I feel like I could see this easily being adapted well into a visual format. And believe it or not, the franchise has tried before. In the producer's cut of Halloween 6, Danny hears the same voice that Michael did.
Stay out of it.
So once again, check out my Thorn Trilogy deep dive from last year. Really great supplemental viewing for this if you want to hear more about how Daniel Farrens was inspired by this book. I just cannot stress enough that his original script sounded so good. It did not deserve the Weinstein treatment. Anyway, the book gets a little too into Michael's POV though, if you couldn't tell already. This scene goes on to describe him testing windows and testing doors, trying to get into houses. He drifted back to the front of the house and pressed against the hedges as a gaggle of children passed by, close enough for him to grab. It was too dangerous. When it was safe, he ventured across the street. What do you mean it's too dangerous for Michael Myers with children running around? This detracts a little bit from what's presented in the film, where Michael just pops up out of nowhere, very boogeyman vibes. The sexual element also adds this degree of realism that I do not appreciate. Michael ends up at Lindsay's house, like the movie. He returned to the main house and watched some more. The sex between his legs throbbed in an unpleasant way. I'm just very curious your thoughts on this. I like my Michael to be an empty killing machine, devoid of any thought or emotion. He's just moved by some inexplicable force. I don't like that in the novel he's given like the most basic serial killer motivation of sexual arousal. It's giving boring. It's giving contrast to the cool ancient Celtic inspiration. I don't know. I can't even read out most of this because I don't want this video to like get shadow banned for being inappropriate, but his eyes like are scanning Annie from the window and he describes her various body parts and it makes him breathe heavily. I just don't like it. So let's now move on to something a little bit more lighthearted. We know that Annie kind of has to convince Lindsay of her plans that night, and in the movie it's kind of suggested that Lindsay might have a crush on Tommy. In the book it's quite the opposite. Well, come on, get your coat. My coat? Where are we going? Across the street to Tommy Doyle's. I don't like Tommy Doyle. It's always so interesting to me what little bits these authors of the novelizations will choose to change. And in this case, it's probably just like he has a word count to hit, so he's just going to add a little bit more dialogue. So Lindsay being a little bit difficult initially would provide this. But you do have to wonder. Also, I'm brushing over all of it, but God, does he just keep mentioning Annie's boobs in this chapter. A more welcome addition in this scene is that her dad actually calls her and reminds her to be safe. Then there is the tragic irony of her immediate death following this. And in the book, we actually get access to her inner monologue. And we know in the film she is strangled by Myers, but in the book, he adds in a deep stab for good measure. She could actually hear her mind contemplating the length and coldness of the long blade as it penetrated, but she didn't really feel any pain. The terror and resignation had made her impervious to it. She knew she was dead, and in her last moment, she was aware of a blend of surprise and regret that the event could be so peaceful and undramatic. She wished she could have said a proper goodbye to her parents. She wished she'd understood her father's warning to be careful. She wondered if she'd be reborn and get a second chance to be careful. The light faded, and the last thing she heard was the car horn. I love Annie. I feel like this helps to kind of dignify her last moments a little bit, and I'm so glad that after pages of reading about her body parts, we are not in Michael's head for this scene. Surprisingly, after this, we take a little detour with Lonnie Elam. This further fuels my theory that David Gordon Green and team were heavily going off of this book for their trilogy. Lonnie and his friends are out pulling pranks on their poor neighbors, and they decide to crawl up next to someone's window and pop up, banging on the window, scaring the kids inside. If you ever wonder what Lonnie was up to between mixing it up with other kids and getting yelled at by Loomis, there you go. A couple more lore drops ensue, starting with Bob, of all characters. His name was Bob Sims, and the girls all thought he was gorgeous. He was tall and lanky, a pitcher for the baseball team, a tight end for the football team, possible valedictorian of the class, and at least one of its top 3 or 4 scholars. He could have any college he wanted and any girl. It's funny that I just never really got that vibe from Bob, but when I was in high school in the early 2010s, I think jocks were a lot different to how they were in the 70s. Once again, if you were ever curious about the layers of Bob, there you go. One thing they kept almost word for word in his scene with Linda is something that I definitely could have done without. It's when he and Linda are joking about Lindsay and ripping her clothes off. Like, that's an 8-year-old girl. It's just weird. Unfortunately, their fate is no better in the novel than it is in the movie. They have quite a bit of graphic fun, though, before the fact, and it is literally porn. So, hey, if you're a fan of romance novels, you enjoy book and you also love horror, this is a great little blend of the two. We do get another peek into Michael's head before he kills them. After that incredible moment of thrill as he plunged the blade into the dark-haired girl's abdomen and slit her stomach open to the ribs, he had come down to a state of euphoric calm. For a while he thought that the lust was permanently discharged and the voice quieted. That was how it had been then with Judy. But then he had been 6 years old, now it was different. The sight of the couple on the couch had brought new stirring in his body, and the voice was whispering to him once more. He knew this night was not over. Michael has emotions all over the place. Like, what do you mean he experiences this euphoria after he kills and he's just like horny all the time? He's just like a regular serial killer in this piece. So kills Bob, kills Linda. Yes, Linda still has her iconic line of, you know, did I get your ghost? But then a wild lore drop also occurs when he's strangling Linda in just 9 words. He gripped her more tightly despite this searing pain. Michael feels pain, by the way. Searing pain, even. And it's while she's clawing at his hand and tearing up his flesh, which has to be nothing compared to the bullets he takes later, by the way. way. I guess in the movie, Michael does react very strongly to the hanger poking his eye. This isn't really news, but I like to think of it as more of a physiological response because the actual sensation of pain happens in your brain. I always like to think of it as more of like an instinctual response. But moving on, then Laurie's night obviously goes south. It was pointed out to me in a live stream not too long ago that Laurie's Halloween night is going completely normally until like the last 15 minutes of the movie. I think the book does a little bit of a better job at building the tension here, not that it needs it, but while she's inspecting the house where Linda and Bob are supposed to be, she makes her way into the living room, and from there she hears a crash upstairs and something being dragged. We can maybe assume that it was a body or maybe the tombstone. So then she runs to the bottom of the stairs, and another interesting addition to the scene is that she sees an orange light glowing from under the door. We then switch back to Loomis's perspective, where in the movie he presumably is just getting a hunch that guides him. In the book, he's trying to reason with himself and why he feels like he's barking up the wrong tree and that it's an intellectual decision, but it's not. It's actually just this feeling that comes over him. At a certain corner, he felt strongly drawn and decided to let the force carry him, even if he lost his sight of the Myers house entirely. It was as if he were the planchette on a Ouija board and someone had asked him, is a murderer near at hand? The force of the vibrations was sending him where? Down this oak-lined street toward the car? Why that car? I hadn't connected this until now when I was scripting this, but Edna was cursed to have his soul relive his torment on Earth over and over. Is Loomis Michael's counterpart in his destiny? The bringer of his fate, perhaps? I find it really interesting that Loomis is compelled not by his obsession, but by something that sounds like it's straight out of Star Wars. And Star Wars had come out just 2 years before this novel, so the Force was very in style at the time. While Loomis is doing Jedi training or whatever, we switch back to Laurie's POV. The descriptions of her dead friends as she discovers them in the book are a lot more graphic, which is tonally different to the film, which is a lot more subtle, but then her ensuing interactions with Michael are all the same. My earlier feelings about Loomis being tied to Michael are more or less confirmed in the next few pages. Sam Loomis ran up the street, head tilted like a bloodhound trying to pick up a scent, except this wasn't a smell he was seeking, but a feeling, a vibration. You're getting hot. No, you're getting cold. No, you're getting hot again. Hotter, no colder. A voice seemed to say to him. He's not explicitly hearing a voice, but the connection to Michael's affliction feels very apparent to me. Honestly, I like this. I feel like it makes Loomis make a little bit more sense to me, especially when we get into his crazy Loomis era, when in Halloween 5 he's literally using Jamie as bait. Now I'd like to think that he was just being compelled by this ancient Celtic curse to be doing stupid things like that. Granted, there is the humor element for me of him just truly losing his marbles, but anyway. Just like Annie's near-death thoughts, I feel like this is a proper extension of the character. I have a feeling that may be divisive, so as always, let me know your thoughts down below. We get a similar moment with Laurie as she is now facing near death. First, she starts getting all these snapshot memories of her life. A trip to Michigan with her dad, a cake that she baked with her mom, a baby raccoon that she tried to turn into her pet. She wondered what it would have been like to go to bed with a man. She wondered who would come to her funeral. She wondered what grades your teachers gave you if you died mid-term. She wondered what they'd dress her in for her funeral and whether her face would be mutilated when they opened the coffin. She wondered what would have happened if she'd kept her date with Ben Tramer. She wondered what it was like to die and to be dead. This is right before she luckily discovers the knitting needle sitting right next to her, and Michael starts choking her, and canonically he has stank breath. I know you were just dying for those kind of juicy details when you clicked on this video. During her fight with Michael upstairs, there is an added beat where she has to trick him to grab his knife. She takes his one blind eye to distract him and leads him to the other side of the room so that she can grab it. "Over here, pal, here I am. Come and get me," she beckoned, almost seductively. I love the dialogue. I feel like it really embodies the end of her character arc. She's now this strong final girl, and then he ruins it by making it sexual. Like, what business does this line have being delivered seductively? Oh, and then she stabs him in the Johnson, plunge the blade upward with both hands into his groin, and he describes Michael bellowing in pain, which, even though there's this whole supernatural element of Edna's curse, that kind of detail just humanizes him like crazy to me. I like that in the movie the most we get is him just kind of breathing heavily with exertion. For him to be crying out and stuff, again, it's just not giving boogeyman. Now when we go back to Loomis, this is the first, I feel like, more explicit nod to Halloween 2. "You don't know what death is one of the funniest line deliveries of Halloween 2, especially how it's coupled with Loomis kind of hobbling off afterwards.
You don't know what death is.
Had to give a shout out that that line does exist in this book. I had my conspiracies earlier about this book's connection to Halloween 2. That was kind of the only other thing I can find. What do you make of it? We're now in the final minutes of the film and the final pages of the book here, but there's some really juicy stuff. We actually get a detailed explanation of Michael's face. Through the darkness and the flashing lights dancing in her eyes, she looked at his face and saw it. White with wider fang-like teeth. His wet black hair was matted over his forehead, and one eye bulged like a dead fish's. Where his other eye had been was a wet bloody hole. Fang-like teeth? No. To me, once again, that kind of a detail is just the antithesis to Michael and what makes him scary, because he is literally just a dude. If you took his mask off, you would lose him in a crowd. That very idea increases real-life paranoia for some people. That's why it was such an effective movie at the time and why it remains as such for a lot of people. So to give him like a quasi-vampire look, I don't get that. Loomis comes in and saves the day, of course, and Curtis adds in some more dialogue here. Nothing really too much of note. Just like, are you a policeman? No. Oh, well, thank God you have a gun. That kind of thing. One pretty significant change is that when Michael goes over the railing, he doesn't disappear quite as quickly. It lay on its back amid 1,000 shards of broken glass that twinkled in the moonlight like hoarfrost. The front of the uniform stolen from the truck driver glistened blackly with blood that seeped out of the tremendous rents in his flesh, caused by Loomis's magnum. One of its eyes gazed stupidly up to the sky, where the other had been was a black hole caked with clotted blood and jellied aqueous humor. Loomis stared at the corpse a long time, watching for a sign of life. Detecting none, he turned back into the bedroom and reached into his trench coat pocket. For all intents and purposes, Michael dies in the book. And I know that I'm reading off a lot here, but there's just a lot to be unpacked from literally the last page. Until this moment, he had hoped against hope that the entity he had pursued to this place was a thing of flesh and blood like himself, though deep in his heart he had known it would be otherwise. The evidence pointed not merely to another interpretation, but, as he had said to Sheriff Brackett, to another dimension. Is Loomis suggesting that Michael hadn't just resurrected and run off somewhere, but rather that he's traveled somewhere else entirely? Is he possibly in the realm of Edna's floating soul? This was pre-Halloween 2, written before anyone knew that there would even be a sequel, so it's a wild swing at an answer for the ending of the film. He shuddered, wondering what little boy at this very moment was tossing in his sleep, tortured by a dream of tragic love that had occurred far away and long ago, tormented by a voice commanding the dreamer to take revenge, implying that the curse will be passed on as it was decreed in the beginning of the book. How interesting would it have been if the franchise had explored what would happen if the curse were passed on? Oh wait, they did, in Halloween 4, which everyone loved. And oh wait, they did, in Halloween Ends, which everyone hated. I think it's great. I think it's a great story. It's very dramatic. It feels fairy tale-like. It reminds me a lot of Michael Dougherty's Trick or Treat, which I also did a deep dive on a few weeks ago. Definitely check it out. Hence why this was my costume this year. Of course, it doesn't really fully align with John Carpenter's Halloween, which is grounded, but it has the looming mystery of who and what Michael Myers is. The book seems like a different version entirely, but it's nice that we can have both, I guess. And then the book ends with the iconic lines, "It was the boogeyman, wasn't it?" As a matter of fact, it was. But was it though? I guess I'll let you be the judge of that. We can debate and compare notes in the comment section down below. What do you think? Was this book what you expected at all? What were the biggest surprises to you? What do you think of all these explanations of Michael's affliction and his need to kill after, I think most of us presumed that he never really had a motive? These are just some of the questions that I'd love to open up with you, so have at it. If this video left you thirsting for more, I have done more deep dives on the Halloween franchise than I think just about anything else on this channel. So just wait, a playlist will pop up at the end of this video and you can explore all of that. There's all types of content on this channel though. I do a lot of reviews, I do other types of deep dives, I cover, original versus remakes, and if that's still not enough, channel members and patrons get even more bonus content. Depending on which tier you join on the Patreon, you get a bonus video every single week. And if that's still not enough, there is more free content on my second channel where I primarily talk about physical media. I also vlog over there. I have opened up kind of about my adoption journey over there. All my social media and my resources for this video will be linked down below. But more than anything, I am wishing you a happy and safe Samhain. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that I catch you in the next one. Bye.